At 3:42 p.m. local time in the Southern Caribbean Sea, the ocean looked deceptively calm. At the center of that calm moved USS George Washington, one of the United States Navy's nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, operating legally in international waters. No exercises were scheduled. No flight operations were underway. This was a standard movement, a carrier strike group maintaining presence, visibility, and readiness. On the surface, nothing was unusual. Below the flight deck, inside the Combat Information Center, that perception changed. A radar technician leaned forward in his chair, eyes fixed on the scope. "New surface contacts," he reported. Not one, not two, 6. The contacts appeared almost simultaneously, spaced wide across the screen. At first glance, they could have been dismissed as routine regional traffic, but within seconds, the system flagged something off. None of the vessels were broadcasting AIS identification, no automated signals, no commercial markers, and more importantly, their relative motion didn't match civilian shipping behavior. They were maneuvering with intent. The contacts were coming from multiple bearings, closing distance at moderate but deliberate speed. Not rushing, not drifting, adjusting course in coordination. To trained naval watch standards, the geometry told a clear story. This was not coincidence. It was convergence. On the bridge, the officer of the deck was notified. The range was still outside immediate concern, but the pattern warranted attention. The order was simple and calm. Log everything. Track continuously. Maintain course. There was no change in speed, no maneuver to avoid. Professional restraint was the posture. As the minutes passed, the 6 contacts continued to tighten their formation. What had begun as a wide arc began to compress. Bearings shifted, distances closed. The closest point of approach was recalculated under 5 nautical miles and shrinking. Radio hails were transmitted on international maritime frequencies. No response. A second hail followed, this time repeated in Spanish. Still nothing. Silence at sea can mean many things. In this case, it meant choice. By 3:49 p.m., visual confirmation came in from optical sensors. The contacts were Venezuelan naval vessels, patrol ships and light combatants, smaller than the carrier, but unmistakably military. Hull numbers were logged. Mast profiles matched known Venezuelan classes. Their decks were active, crews visible, wake patterns sharp. 6 warships, 1 carrier. The imbalance in raw power was obvious. But power isn't always measured in tonnage. In close-range maritime encounters, proximity creates leverage. Risk rises not from firepower alone, but from distance, speed, and miscalculation. Inside the CIC, the atmosphere remained controlled. No raised voices, no alarms. Systems hummed steadily. Radar tracks were tagged and updated. Electronic support measures quietly listened, recording emissions, frequencies, and behavior. This was not escalation. Not yet, but it was no longer routine. At 3:53 p.m., one of the Venezuelan vessels adjusted course sharply, angling closer to the carrier's starboard quarter. Another mirrored the move from the opposite side. 2 more slowed slightly, holding position ahead. The remaining pair lagged astern. A loose ring was forming. To an untrained eye, it might have looked uncoordinated. To naval professionals, it was unmistakable. A soft encirclement, pressure without contact, presence without provocation. The kind of maneuver designed to test reactions, generate footage, and force a response. On board the carrier, no one rushed to the rails. No aircraft were launched. No warnings were issued beyond standard hails. The ship held its heading, steady and predictable. Because in moments like this, every move is a message. And the most powerful message the U.S. Navy can send is discipline. At 3:56 p.m., the closest Venezuelan vessel crossed inside 3 nautical miles. That was the moment every watchstander recognized. This was no longer observation. This was an encounter, and the situation was about to escalate fast. By 3:57 p.m., the geometry of the encounter had fully taken shape. 6 Venezuelan warships now occupied distinct positions around the carrier's projected track. 2 off the bow, offset just enough to force attention. 2 pacing along the flanks. 2 trailing at a measured distance astern. None were close enough to collide. All were close enough to matter. Inside the Combat Information Center aboard USS George Washington, every movement was being logged in real time. Bearings updated, speeds recalculated, closest points of approach continuously refined down to 10 of a nautical mile. This wasn't guesswork. It was math, training, and muscle memory. The carrier maintained steady speed. No course change, no visible reaction. That choice was deliberate. In naval doctrine, predictability under pressure is not weakness. It is control. Sudden maneuvers invite misinterpretation. Holding course denies the other side an excuse to escalate, while placing full responsibility for unsafe behavior squarely on the approaching vessels. At 3:59 p.m., the first Venezuelan ship crossed inside 2.5 nautical miles. Its wake sharpened as engines pushed slightly harder. Optical feeds confirmed crew movement near the bridge and forward deck. No weapons were manned, no guns trained, but the posture was alert. Radio hails went out again. This is United States Navy warship operating in international waters. You are approaching at unsafe distance. State your intentions. The reply channel remained silent. Electronic support measures picked up intermittent emissions, low-power radar sweeps, not fire control. Not targeting, but active sensing. The kind used to build situational awareness or to probe for reactions. Every signal was recorded. This was the gray zone, the space between peace and conflict, where actions are designed to intimidate without crossing a legal threshold. Venezuela was applying pressure without firing a shot, counting on proximity to do the work. On the carrier's bridge, the captain observed quietly. There was no rush to action because action was already underway, just not the kind visible on camera. Escort ships adjusted subtly, maintaining protective arcs without advertising movement. Aviation crews stood by, not scrambling, but ready. The carrier's defensive systems remained passive, listening rather than speaking. At 4:03 p.m., the formation tightened again. One Venezuelan vessel ahead slowed, forcing the carrier's escorts to account for reduced CM. Another cut laterally across the carrier's projected path, still outside collision distance, but close enough to shorten reaction time. The remaining ships held their positions, completing the impression of a moving ring. This was no accident. It required coordination, communication, and intent. Still no response to hails. In these encounters, silence is often the loudest signal. It allows one side to claim later that nothing was said, nothing was heard, nothing was ordered. Ambiguity becomes a shield, but ambiguity cuts both ways. By 4:06 p.m., the closest point of approach dropped under 2 nautical miles. That crossed a line, not a legal one, but a professional one. At that distance, even a minor steering error could create an international incident. Inside the CIC, the call went out calmly. Contact maneuvering with intent. No alarms sounded. No voices rose. Procedures flowed exactly as written. Non-lethal options were reviewed. Aviation assets prepared for potential launch, not to threaten, but to observe. Cameras, sensors, and recorders were the priority. Evidence mattered more than theatrics. Because if this encounter ended badly, the story would be told not by whoever spoke the loudest, but by whoever had the cleanest record. On the Venezuelan ships, the crews could now see the scale of what they were surrounding. The carrier's island towered above the horizon. The flight deck stretched longer than their entire hulls. Radar arrays and antennas remained motionless, almost indifferent. That was the point. At 4:09 p.m., the Venezuelan formation hesitated just slightly. A fractional reduction in speed from one ship. A minor course correction from another. Enough to notice, not enough to disengage. They were testing how far they could go. The carrier did not flinch, because in the U.S. Navy, escalation is not driven by ego. It is driven by necessity, and necessity had not yet arrived. But the margin for error was shrinking, and everyone involved on every bridge, in every operation center, understood the same thing. The next move would decide whether this remained a demonstration or became something else entirely. At 4:11 p.m., the tone of the encounter changed. It didn't change with a shout, a warning shot, or a sudden maneuver. It changed quietly inside the systems. Electronic support measures aboard USS George Washington registered a shift. One of the Venezuelan vessels had increased the strength and consistency of its radar emissions. Still not fire control grade, still not a weapons lock, but no longer passive. They were actively looking inside the Combat Information Center. The data was clear. Frequency bands, pulse repetition rates, sweep intervals. Every emission was cataloged in real time. The carrier wasn't responding electronically. It didn't need to. Listening was enough. This was no longer just maneuvering at sea. This was interaction in the electromagnetic domain. By 4:13 p.m., on the closest Venezuelan ship tightened its turn again, angling toward the carrier's starboard side. The distance fell below 2 nautical miles. At that range, visual detail was unmistakable. Deck crews could see faces, helmets, hands on railings. Still no weapons manned, still no hails answered. The U.S. Navy's posture remained unchanged, but behind that calm surface, layers were activating. Escort ships adjusted their relative positions by degrees, not miles. Small changes invisible to cameras, but critical to coverage. Defensive arcs were maintained. Blind spots eliminated. Every move calculated to protect the carrier, without escalating the encounter. Above deck, aviation crews received quiet updates. No scramble order, no dramatic launch, just readiness. A helicopter sat staged, rotors still, crew strapped in. Its role, if called, would not be aggression. It would be observation. Eyes matter. At 4:15 p.m., one Venezuelan vessel broke formation slightly, drifting aft before correcting back into position. Another slowed, forcing its partner to compensate. These were small signs, but experienced watchstanders recognized them immediately. Coordination was being tested. Pressure at sea is difficult to maintain. It requires discipline, timing, and confidence. The closer ships get, the harder it becomes to hide hesitation. Inside the CIC, a new designation was logged. Escalatory behavior, non-kinetic. That phrase carries weight. It means the situation has moved beyond navigation and into intent. It does not authorize force, but it narrows options. Radio hails went out again. Short, professional, recorded. This is United States Navy warship. Your maneuvers are unsafe. Alter course immediately again. No response. By 4:18 p.m., the Venezuelan ships had completed nearly a full loose encirclement. Not tight enough to trap, not wide enough to disengage easily. It was a posture meant to be seen, a message for cameras, for audiences far from the water. But encounters at sea are not judged by appearance alone. They are judged by control. The carrier held speed, held course, held discipline. No sudden turns, no visible reaction. That choice forced the burden of safety onto the surrounding ships. If anything went wrong now, responsibility would be unmistakable. At 4:20 p.m., electronic systems aboard the carrier quietly shifted modes. Defensive sensors refined their focus. Not active targeting, not aggressive emission, just readiness. The difference mattered because readiness shortens timelines, and when timelines shorten, mistakes become costly. The Venezuelan commanders knew this. They could feel it even if they couldn't see it. The longer they stayed close, the less room they had to maneuver politically and physically. One ship reduced speed by a fraction. Another drifted outward by a few degrees. Not a retreat, but not commitment either. This was the edge. No one had fired. No one had shouted. But the encounter had reached the point where systems, not intentions, would decide what happened next. And systems do not negotiate. They respond. By 4:22 p.m., the standoff was balanced on a narrow line between presence and provocation, between pressure and miscalculation. The question was no longer whether this situation could escalate. It was whether either side would choose to let it. And the next phase was already forming. At 4:23 p.m., the encounter reached its inflection point. Not with a collision warning, not with a weapon trained, but with air moving above the water. A U.S. Navy helicopter lifted smoothly from the deck of USS George Washington, its rotors cutting clean arcs through the humid Caribbean air. There was no dramatic climb, no aggressive dive. The aircraft rose to a controlled altitude and took a steady course toward the outer edge of the Venezuelan formation. This was not a show of force. It was a show of clarity. From the cockpit, the crew had full visibility of the surface picture. High-resolution optics locked onto hull numbers, deck activity, and bridge posture. Forward-looking infrared highlighted exhaust plumes, engine loads, and heat signatures. Every frame was time-stamped, every angle recorded. The helicopter stayed outside unsafe distance, always visible, always calm. That mattered. In maritime confrontations, escalation often comes from ambiguity, from uncertainty about intent, distance, or perception. The helicopter removed that uncertainty. It made observation undeniable. At 4:25 p.m., one of the Venezuelan ships altered course slightly outward, breaking the symmetry of the ring. The move was subtle but unmistakable. Another ship reduced speed moments later, its wake flattening as engines eased back. The encirclement was loosening. No commands were shouted. No warnings issued beyond standard procedure. The U.S. Navy did not need to push. Pressure in this moment worked both ways. The helicopter held its orbit. Sensors trained, communications minimal. Its presence carried an implicit message. Everything here is being seen, recorded, and preserved. Not for headlines, for accountability. On the Venezuelan bridges, the calculus was changing. Remaining close meant accepting increasing risk, with diminishing leverage. Every minute inside tight proximity increased the chance of error. Every recorded maneuver reduced plausible deniability. And every system aboard the carrier and its escorts remained poised, not aggressive, but fully prepared. At 4:28 p.m., another Venezuelan vessel drifted outward by several degrees. The formation no longer resembled a ring. It became an arc, still present, still watching, but no longer constricting. The imbalance was now visible. 6 ships could surround a carrier visually. They could not surround its awareness. The carrier strike group controlled the information space, radar, optics, electronic signatures, and legal record. Venezuela could apply pressure through proximity, but it could not sustain dominance in that environment. By 4:30 p.m., the helicopter completed a slow pass along the outer edge of the formation, then widened its orbit. The maneuver was deliberate. No hovering over decks, no intimidation, just distance and documentation. On the surface, the Venezuelan ships continued to adjust. Small course changes, minor speed reductions, incremental spacing increases. No single action declared disengagement, but together they told a clear story. The escalation had peaked. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the assessment was updated. Pressure reduced, formation degrading. That assessment did not signal victory. It signaled stability. The carrier maintained course, maintained speed, maintained discipline. There was no need to capitalize, no need to chase. In gray zone confrontations, restraint preserves advantage. At 4:33 p.m., the helicopter turned back toward the carrier. Mission complete. It had delivered eyes, clarity, and consequence without provoking reaction. Behind it, the Venezuelan vessels continued to drift outward, their loose arc expanding into normal operating distance. The ring was gone. No weapons had been raised, no orders shouted, no shots fired. Yet the outcome was unmistakable. The encounter had tested proximity, intent, and resolve. And when the pressure reached its limit, only one side retained full control of the situation. By the time the helicopter touched back down on deck, the carrier strike group was already transitioning back to routine posture. Because for the U.S. Navy, the objective was never confrontation. It was control. And control had been achieved. By 4:36 p.m., the Caribbean Sea had begun to return to its earlier stillness. The Venezuelan vessels were no longer maneuvering in concert. Distances widened, bearings stabilized. What remained was presence without pressure. 6 ships now operating independently, no longer attempting to shape the carrier's movement. From the bridge of USS George Washington, the scene was unremarkable again. Engine steady, course unchanged. The ship continued forward exactly as planned, its transit uninterrupted. But what had just occurred would not fade with the wake. Below deck, the work had only begun. Inside the Combat Information Center, the encounter was being closed out methodically. Radar tracks were finalized, timestamps verified, optical footage cross-referenced with electronic logs. Every radio hail, every maneuver, every emission was cataloged into a single coherent record. This was not paperwork for its own sake. In modern naval operations, documentation is deterrence. It defines responsibility. It removes ambiguity, and it ensures that if questions are asked later by governments, by allies, by international bodies, the answers are precise. The Venezuelan ships had not fired. Neither had the United States, but intent had been measured and outcome recorded. From a tactical standpoint, the result was clear. The carrier strike group retained freedom of movement. No alteration of course, no reduction in speed, no operational delay. The surrounding vessels disengaged without forcing escalation. From a strategic standpoint, the implications were broader. Encounters like this are not about winning a battle. They are about shaping behavior. Venezuela had tested proximity as a tool of pressure, a gray zone tactic designed to provoke reaction without crossing legal thresholds. The U.S. Navy responded with discipline, visibility, and control. No sudden maneuvers, no aggressive emissions, no kinetic response, just presence recorded and undeniable. The balance of power at sea is not defined by who gets closest. It is defined by who controls the timeline. And throughout the encounter, the timeline belonged to the carrier strike group. As the distance between ships increased, escort vessels quietly resumed standard screening positions. Aviation crews secured equipment. Sensors returned to routine monitoring. The transition was seamless because it was rehearsed. Professional navies do not celebrate restraint. They normalize it. By 4:42 p.m., the Venezuelan vessels were operating well outside unsafe distance. The encounter was effectively over. No formal communication followed. None was required. At sea, silence after disengagement is often intentional. It allows both sides to step back without loss of face. It preserves stability without forcing declarations. That silence carried weight. The carrier continued its transit through international waters, exactly as international law allows. The surrounding ocean returned to routine traffic patterns. To an observer hours later, there would be no visible trace of what had occurred. But the systems remembered every radar sweep, every course change, every moment inside close proximity. Those records would inform future encounters, not just in the Caribbean, but wherever pressure tactics are tested against presence. Because the lesson of this encounter was not dramatic. It was procedural. When challenged at sea, escalation is not inevitable. Discipline can be decisive. Documentation can outweigh provocation, and control does not require confrontation. The Venezuelan ships had approached with intent. They had applied pressure. And when the situation reached its limit, they disengaged, not because they were ordered to, but because the balance left them no alternative. No missiles were fired that afternoon. No warnings echoed across the water. No headlines were written in real time. Yet the message was unmistakable. At sea, restraint backed by capability is not weakness. It is dominance.